There is a recording that exists only because a doctor decided, without permission, to press a button on his phone. It was made in the final weeks of Michael Jackson's life, and for a long time almost no one knew it existed. When it finally surfaced in a Los Angeles courtroom, it did not sound like the man the world thought it knew. It sounded like someone very far away, trying to hold onto an idea that mattered more to him than anything else, even as his own voice kept dissolving underneath him. The recording was made in early May of 2009 by Drive Conrad Murray, the physician who had been hired to look after Jackson during preparations for his comeback tour. Jackson had no idea he was being recorded. On the tape, his speech is slow, slurred, and heavy, the words dragging into each other, long silences stretching between thoughts, as though he were fighting to stay conscious. And yet, through all of that fog, he keeps circling back to the same subject. He talks about wanting his upcoming shows to be unlike anything audiences had ever witnessed, comparing his ambitions to Elvis Presley and the Beatles. Then, almost without transition, he begins talking about children. He says he wants to build the largest children's hospital in the world because he understands suffering children in a way most people never could. He explains that he never had a real childhood himself, and that the pain of that loss is woven into songs like Heal the World and Will You Be There? It is a strange, aching moment, a global superstar barely able to form sentences, still reaching for some kind of purpose beyond himself. When prosecutors played that recording during Murray's 2011 involuntary manslaughter trial, the effect on the courtroom was immediate. Jurors sat in silence. People who had known Jackson personally struggled to stay composed. The prosecution did not need commentary to make its point. The recording did that on its own because it captured, unintentionally, the very last months of a man who was clearly suffering while presenting a public face of confidence and control. That contradiction becomes even sharper when you look at what was happening on stage during those same weeks. In the days before his death, people close to Jackson had grown seriously worried. He had appeared frail during rehearsals for what was supposed to be a 50-show concert residency at London's O2 Arena, part of a run titled This Is It. He sometimes struggled to remember choreography, seemed unsteady, and needed reassurance to keep going. Kenny Ortega, the show's director and a longtime collaborator, was so concerned that he wrote to the tour's promoters urging that Jackson see a psychiatrist, citing visible signs of anxiety and emotional strain. Then, on the night of June 23, 2009, something shifted. Jackson arrived at the Staples Center for what would be his final rehearsal, and, by most accounts from people in the room, he performed with striking energy. He moved through Earth Song with intensity, worked through the choreography of Thriller without lowering the key, and appeared for those few hours like the performer audiences remembered from decades earlier. Footage from that rehearsal was later edited into the documentary This Is It, which went on to become one of the highest-grossing concert films ever released, taking in more than $260 million worldwide. Audiences who watched it were, in effect, watching the final working hours of his life, unaware of what would follow less than 2 days later. After that rehearsal, Jackson was driven back to the rented home on Carrollwood Drive in the early hours of June 24th. What awaited him there had nothing to do with normal rest. According to Murray's own account, given to police 2 days after Jackson's death, the doctor spent hours that night trying to get Jackson to sleep using a rotating combination of sedatives, Valium, then intravenous lorazepam, then midazolam. None of it worked for long. By Murray's telling, Jackson would doze for only a few minutes before waking again, and by mid-morning on June 25th, he was reportedly pleading with Murray, saying he needed to sleep because he had rehearsals to prepare for and a show in England he had to be ready for. It is worth remembering that everything about this sequence comes from Murray's statement to detectives, made by a man with strong incentive to present himself favorably, so it should be read with that caveat in mind. By Murray's account, he ultimately administered propofol, a powerful anesthetic typically reserved for surgical settings and administered in hospitals with continuous monitoring equipment. There was no such monitoring in that bedroom. Murray told police he gave Jackson 25 milligrams and then stepped out to use the bathroom. leaving Jackson unsupervised for a period he described as brief. When he returned, Jackson was no longer breathing. What happened next became the central turning point of the criminal case. Rather than immediately calling for emergency help, Murray began gathering medication from the room. This came to light through the testimony of Alberto Alvarez, the head of Jackson's security team, who was among the first people to reach the bedroom. Alvarez testified that he found Murray performing chest compressions on Jackson while he was still lying on the soft mattress of the bed, a detail medical professionals noted would make effective compressions essentially impossible, since a mattress absorbs the force needed to circulate blood. Alvarez also testified that Jackson's children, Paris and Prince, appeared in the doorway during this chaos and that Paris screamed for her father before being ushered away. According to Alvarez, before instructing anyone to call 911, Murray asked him to help collect vials of medication into a bag, including a saline bag with a bottle of propofol concealed inside it. Only after this collection had taken place did Murray tell him to call for emergency assistance. That detail mattered enormously at trial because it meant the effort to preserve or obscure evidence of what had been given to Jackson took priority, at least for some window of time, over the effort to save his life. It also later emerged that the propofol bottle recovered from the bedroom held 1,000 milligrams, far more than the 25 milligrams Murray initially told investigators he had administered, a discrepancy that helped prosecution experts argue Jackson had received a much larger and more dangerous dose than Murray was willing to admit. The timeline around the emergency call also drew intense scrutiny. Phone records showed Murray was on a call with an acquaintance in Houston around 11:51 that morning when the person on the other end heard him go quiet, followed by sounds of commotion as though the phone had been dropped. Investigators believed this was close to the moment Murray discovered Jackson was not breathing. Yet the actual 911 call was not placed until roughly 20 minutes past 12, meaning close to 20 minutes may have passed between the apparent discovery and the request for emergency help. When paramedics arrived, Murray told them he had given Jackson only lorazepam, never mentioning propofol at all, which meant the medical responders were trying to revive him without knowing what was actually in his system. Jackson was taken to UCLA Medical Center, where a team worked on him for more than an hour before he was pronounced dead at 2:26 p.m. on June 25, 2009. He was 50 years old. The Los Angeles County coroner ruled the cause of death acute propofol intoxication, with other sedatives contributing, and classified the manner of death as homicide, a legal designation meaning death caused by another person's actions rather than a finding of intentional murder. Behind the medical details lay a financial story that helps explain why Jackson had placed himself in such a precarious situation in the first place. A petition filed by executors of Jackson's estate in 2024 revealed that at the time of his death, his most significant assets were burdened by more than $500 million in debt and creditors' claims, some accruing interest at extremely high rates, and some already in default, with more than 65 separate creditor claims pending against him. His death also left his estate financially liable for $40 million owed to EEG, the promoter of the London residency, since the shows never took place. A defense witness in the later civil trial involving EG testified that Jackson's spending on charity, travel, art, furniture, and jewelry had outpaced his income for years, alongside enormous interest payments on existing loans. The This Is It residency, originally announced as 10 shows before ticket demand pushed it to 50, represented a genuine financial lifeline, tied closely to protecting valuable assets, including his stake in a catalog containing Beatles publishing rights. Conrad Murray himself was facing serious financial pressure of his own at the time, having filed for bankruptcy previously and accumulated significant personal debt. He had reportedly been offered around $150,000 a month to serve as Jackson's personal physician during tour preparations, though the formal contract was never completed, and Murray later said he was never actually paid under it. He nonetheless closed his medical practice to focus entirely on caring for Jackson. At trial, prosecution expert Dr. Stephen Schaefer, a specialist in propofol and anesthesia, dismantled the defense's theory that Jackson might have injected himself with the fatal dose. He testified that a person under the effects of the sedatives already in Jackson's system could not have administered such an injection to themselves, and that the evidence pointed to Murray having set up a continuous propofol drip and then left the room unmonitored. Judge Michael Pastor, in sentencing Murray to the maximum 4 years for involuntary manslaughter, described the case as involving a pattern of deceit and characterized Murray's secret recording of Jackson in his impaired state as something closer to an insurance policy for himself than an act of medical care. Murray ultimately served less than 2 years before being released due to prison overcrowding and lost his medical license in California. A separate civil case, brought by Jackson's mother Catherine against AEG Live, argued the promoter shared responsibility for hiring Murray. After a trial lasting nearly 5 months in 2013, a jury found AEG not liable, concluding that Murray held a valid medical license at the time he was hired and that this satisfied the company's legal obligations. In the years since, members of Jackson's family have continued to voice doubts about whether the official account tells the whole story. His daughter Paris has said publicly that she believes her father was killed and that he had expressed fears before his death that people were working against him. His sister LaToya has described Murray as a scapegoat for a larger set of circumstances. These are personal beliefs rather than findings supported by the criminal or civil proceedings, but they reflect how unresolved the emotional aftermath of his death has remained for those closest to him. What survives from those final weeks is a strange, layered record. A slurred voice imagining a hospital for children he would never build, rehearsal footage capturing flashes of the performer he still could be, and a 911 call that arrived after the moment it might have mattered most. Together, they form less a mystery than a documented sequence of decisions, financial pressures, and missed interventions that ended the life of one of the most famous entertainers in history at the age of 50.